I'm David Frankel. I'd like to start a talk today by looking at one small part of an excavation. We see it here where Delise is drawing some features in a small room in Marki village. This is in the center of Cyprus and was occupied for 400 or 500 years, around about 4,000 years ago, in what in Cypriot terms we call the early and middle Bronze Age. Here Delise is drawing some features. We'll look at that room in close-up. Here we have the whole of that small room. We call it Unit 51. We can see several different things quite clearly. There is a plaster hearth surround, a semicircle, surrounding an area where the hearth or small fireplace was situated. Behind it, against the wall, is a plastered bench. Well, it's really more of a ledge than a bench you could sit on, but we call them benches for convenience. The wall behind it, like all the walls at the site, was constructed with several courses, 4, 5, 6, or even more, of stones, and above that would have been a mud brick superstructure. There's a doorway on the right, that's from the south side into this small room. So we can see people were using this room with a small fireplace. We can imagine them sitting around that hearth surround. Small fire in the hearth. But if you look a little more closely, and we take away those little arrows and instructions, we can see something else that's interesting. There's some other things that are showing through the hard-packed clay surface. For the floors here were not specially made, they were just leveled areas of soil, much like that of the fill after the walls had collapsed. Look carefully to the right of the room. You can see here another circular plaster, whitish patch, showing up much like the hearth we see on the left. These are traces of an earlier, older hearth. The surround and the bench or ledge behind it. Across the way, we can see there's another thing that's a little unusual. Here we don't have stones for the lower course of the wall. This was where there was an original doorway, now blocked by mud bricks. So what we're seeing here, if we remove that later hearth bench that we looked at before, we can see an entrance from the left, coming into the same small room with a hearth and bench on the other side of the room. We can see this perhaps more clearly in plan. Originally, the room was like this during what we called in our structure and stratigraphic sequence of the site, Phase G. People entered the small room from the left. Later, in what we call Phase H, that doorway was blocked with bricks. A new hearth and bench were constructed against that now continuous wall, and a new doorway opened on the right-hand side, a little differently from almost all the other doorways at the site, which are usually at the end of a wall rather than at the center. So we have a small renovation, a small change, if you like, not necessarily in the primary function of the room as far as we can see from these built-in facilities, but an important change in other ways. Perhaps we can see this more clearly when we put this one unit into a broader context. On the left, we can see Phase G with our Unit 51 in the center. We've shaded in an area of several other rooms of what's quite a complex house or household. It's part of a whole structure, entered from the top left, where we have Unit 13, and then two other rooms further in, 9 and 10. There was also a smaller side room, Unit 57, just near the entrance. These formed a complex of several rooms, of which 51 was part. A small back room, if you like. It was unrelated to rooms to the right-hand side, that is the south of the site. Then our renovations, Phase H, we see that Unit 51, now linked to 52 beside it, was a small two-roomed house, oriented a different way, entered from the different direction, associated with different areas of the site. The older, larger complex that Unit 51 was previously part of was now a ruin. No one was there. It was abandoned. Walls collapsed. Perhaps people used it in other ways, to discard rubbish, perhaps to put their goats or sheep in. It was an empty space. But nearby, other rooms and other buildings continued in use. We can see some of this and other aspects of renovation and change at the site if we go over the wall from that ruined area to Unit 12 on the left, to the north. Here, where Peter and Julia are busy working, Peter documenting, Julia clearing another small hearth and fireplace, pot stand, which you can see in the plan as well. You can see what's happening on the other side of that wall. At the same time as Unit 51 and 52 were being used, and the other spaces in between were the ruinous and empty open space. Let's excavate this area, Unit 12. We're looking northward. Part of the room has been eroded away. There's now a steep cliff and was previously, when the site was occupied, probably a more gentle slope down to the river below. Taking away the plough soil, the photograph on the left, we see the tops of the stone walls preserved. The fill inside is mud brick collapse from the roof and walls of that building. Digging a little deeper, we expose both the floor, as seen on the right-hand side, the right-hand portion of it. Beyond is the hearth that Peter and Julia were documenting, as you saw previously. The black patches, still not excavated, not because this building had burnt down, but small fires, perhaps grass, bushes, and other invasive weeds that had colonized this area after it was abandoned later on in the history of the site. We'll excavate a little more deeply. Here we've cleared the whole surface of that floor. We can see some other features. There's the hearth that we saw them documenting earlier. But in the corner there's a stone-lined bench and a solid setting for a storage jar. There are a number of features on an abandoned surface. Digging deeper, we find something interesting. We have an earlier wall, parallel to and partly underneath that later wall. Some of it was recycled as a little bench near that fireplace, but others of it was covered up. The floor related to this wall was removed at some stage. It was demolished, the area levelled off, and a new wall built. But let's excavate just a little more deeply. And an earlier wall yet appears, built onto the bedrock. A level floor would have been created at a higher level. It's been removed also by the construction that took place at the time of that middle wall. And then, of course, much later, there was another clearance before the later wall was put in place. So here we can see a sequence of building, rebuilding, more dramatic or drastic renovations and restructuring than in our small Unit 51. But there are nevertheless some other interesting things we can observe from this. The wall alignments are all the same. There's just a shifting a little bit to the side. So there were other structural aspects, architecturally defined or perhaps socially defined, where people could not take over any other space, but only the spaces available to them. There's a continuity of organization, structure, and orientation in this part of the site. There are elsewhere other aspects of small-scale renovations, moving a hearth from one side of the room to another, rebuilding, as we've seen in Unit 51, or more drastic changes such as we see here. And these allow us to put together a more complex history of this site. But let's go back to where we were before, what we'll call for the moment compound 29, where our original space we looked at, unit 51, with its hearth, we can see in the centre of the plan. We can see settings for storage jars along the wall that's to the bottom of that plan, a workbench, other hearths, you can see them in the photograph as well as on the plan, on the right-hand side, and then a small oven placed against one of the interior walls. There are other features, bases for the posts that held up the roof, and other settings for storage jars. So here we have a complex, a compound, a household. Let's think about what was going on in that household. And here we are fortunate that we have some models, not totally realistic models, but models of people doing things in different circumstances from this period, both from this site, but also from others. Some of them are freestanding models, some were attached to pots, and so on. On the left, we have a woman standing beside a large jar. We can imagine someone then working with those storage jars placed in those solid settings against the wall. The two other women in the next picture perhaps are grinding wheat or barley into flour at a workbench, such as we have against the other side wall. Perhaps not such a clear illustration, perhaps that third woman is in front of one of our circular hearths. Perhaps she's cooking or keeping warm. And the final picture, perhaps this woman is placing things in an oven. Here they're illustrating for us daily life that was taking place within this complex. We know a lot about the other things people handled and used every day, the range of pottery, cooking pots, storage jars, serving bowls, and the like that we find in this area and across the site. And large, heavy querns and the upper grindstones for grinding wheat and barley, very heavy and hard to work. And we can see the women again busy with these, with their material goods, looking after the animals, and also engaged in other activities. An important part of these activities was more to do not with aspects of just daily life and behavior and cooking and working, but with relationships within the family, within the household, or between households. Here we have illustrated a woman, a man next to one another on the left, childbirth in the center, and the woman looking after a little baby on the right. But this really indicates for us continuities and developing relationships and continuity of relationships from one generation to the next within this village. This we can try and project onto the sequences and developments of the architecture and the connections that we saw before. For this, we need to look at the site as a whole. Of course, this isn't the whole area of the site of Marki. It's the part we excavated. It's only a relatively small part of the overall site area. This area was perhaps the first part of the site to be used, and then used for several hundred years, but then gradually people moved away to other parts, leaving most of the older section of the village as ruins. We can see from putting together the various plans, understanding of sequence and development, a series of phases that we can define, and we can reconstruct what they may have been like in this part of the site, the earliest part of the site. Phase A, there was very little surviving, some of it reconstructed and rebuilt in Phase B. Significant changes and expansion during phases C and here Phase D show the area of housing developing, with compounds, some with courtyards, some without, of rectangular houses, and we'll assume flat roofs of this kind. Through phases E and then F, we can see again changes in the overall structure of the settlement, some areas being increasing in their housing density and others falling into ruin. And so we come to our phase H that we've already seen in the part of the site we looked at in detail. Again, changes and some continuities and some discontinuities. We can see it in plan like this. It all looks fairly complex, but through our phases from A through to G, H, and finally I, when the area is almost entirely abandoned, we've coloured different parts of it to signal different households or complexes. Some of these continue through several of our phases. Others are short-lived. Some are bigger than others. Some, although occupying the same area, have internal reconstructions and changes, smaller scale renovations. But we can also use these to think about changing connections, relationships within the village. So we can look in greater detail at just 3 phases in one part of the site. Here, the different coloured compounds we can see in greater detail. In phase G, the central plan, we can see shaded light green our compound 29, that complex of several rooms. The earlier phase F, it was open space, then taken over by a family, built in and made into a very nice home. Phase H, now abandoned. Part of that previous building was renovated and restructured, as we saw with Unit 51 and Unit 52 beside it. Here we're looking at continuities and discontinuities between different parts of the site. Areas getting taken over, some households expanding, others shrinking, losing space as others took it over. We can look at a complex history of relationships, seen architecturally, but we must interpret them socially. Of course, this is not as simple as just a straightforward story, because each of these plans is separated by 2 or maybe more generations. We can't see things happening at a finer scale, but nevertheless we can get some idea of the general sorts of changes and trends as families or individuals negotiated space, expanded and contracted as family size and circumstances changed through time. We can plot this out in this, again, complex looking diagram where we can trace the history of some very long-lasting compounds, and let's think about them as families. From the very earliest establishments, we see what we've called compound 1, but its space essentially then transforming into compound 9, 23, and so on through time, and others similarly, expanding, contracting, and relating. We have here then a series of social relationships and changes, negotiations between neighbours, between one family and another, through long periods of time, a dynamic history of change within a settlement. And so we can see the hard-working women, and of course there were equally hard-working men, busy within their households, out in the fields, and connecting, relating, and developing a complex history of a village that lasted for several hundred years, 4,000 years ago.